J.R.R. Tolkien is known as the perfect writer and storyteller. After all, he spent decades developing languages, genealogies, civilizations, and more, devoting time to the smallest of characters and places just to make sure everything was accurate. But the reality is that Tolkien wasn't perfect. In fact, he made one glaring mistake in his lore that even he acknowledged during his lifetime and labored to resolve in his final few years. So what was this critical error? Well, that would be the elf named Glorfindel. And while many of you might be familiar with this name, you probably don't realize the complex history and controversy behind one of Tolkien's most powerful creations. So in today's video, I'm not only going to go through Glorfindel's entire lore and history, but I'm also going to track every step Tolkien took to resolve a mistake that eventually turned into a being who rivaled even the power of the Maiar themselves. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to Factor Fantasy, a channel where we discuss all things Tolkien, diving into the Lord of the Rings and more each and every week. If you enjoy breakdowns like this one, be sure to like and subscribe and share with a Tolkien-loving friend. Just as a disclaimer before we get into things, I want to make it super clear that I am a Tolkien fan just like you. I'm not a professor or a scholar who has been studying Tolkien for decades. In fact, the reason I'm making this video is because I'm going through Glorfindel's history for the first time as well, and I'm fascinated by this mistake that Tolkien made and how he resolved it. So I'm sort of just sharing my findings with you. As always, drop a comment below if I missed anything or if you have anything interesting to add to the conversation. Anyway, that being said, let's dive into the lore and discover exactly who this ultra-powerful elf is and how he became the legend that we know him as today. To really understand why Glorfindel is such an anomaly, we have to go way back. We need to journey to the First Age, the era of the Silmarillion and the Book of Lost Tales. If you think the War of the Ring was intense, the First Age makes it look like a minor skirmish. This was a time of epic tragedy, of gods walking the earth, and of dragons the size of mountains. And it's here that Glorfindel first carved his name into history. Glorfindel was a lord of the Noldor. Now, if you aren't familiar with the Noldor, think of them as the Deep Elves. They were the most skilled, the most knowledgeable, and the most powerful of all the elven clans. They originally lived in Valinor, the Blessed Realm, soaking up the light of the two trees. But they were also the most proud. When Melkor, who we know later as Morgoth, the original Dark Lord, stole the Silmarils and fled to Middle-earth, the Noldor decided to go after him. This event is known as the Exile. Led by Feanor and his half-brothers Fingolfin and Finarfin, the Noldor defied the Valar in order to seek vengeance on Morgoth. It was a messy, bloody affair tainted by the kinslaying of the Alqualondë, where elves actually killed other elves to steal their ships. And by the way, I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong. But anyway, Glorfindel was a part of the host of Turgon, who is the son of Fingolfin. And right off the bat, he stood out. His name literally translates to golden hair. This was incredibly rare among the Noldor. The royal house and almost all their kin had dark hair. Think Luthien, Arwen, and Elrond. Golden hair was a trait of the Vanyar, the holy elves who stayed in Valinor. This suggests that Glorfindel had some serious Vanyarin ancestry, marking him as unique before he even stepped foot onto the dark shores of Middle-earth. Even though he was an exile who crossed the grinding ice of the Helcaraxë, later notes by Tolkien suggest that his hands were clean. He left Valinor reluctantly, driven by loyalty to Turgon and his kin, rather than a prideful oath of Feanor. Because of this, the Valar considered him essentially blameless in the crimes that cursed his people. For example, he didn't participate in the slaughter of the kinslain. He simply followed Turgon to Middle-earth. Once in Middle-earth, Glorfindel settled in the hidden city of Gondolin. And if you don't know Gondolin, imagine a city of white stone and fountains hidden inside a circle of unscalable mountains, designed to look just like the city of the gods in Valinor. It was the greatest elven city in Middle-earth. Glorfindel wasn't just a citizen here, he was a big deal. He was the lord of the House of the Golden Flower, one of the 12 noble houses of the city. His house was famous for its heraldry, a rayed sun on a shield, and his warriors wore mantles embroidered with gold thread. And while they had a time of peace, we eventually get a glimpse of just how tough Glorfindel is during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. This was a disastrous offensive against Morgoth that went horribly wrong. When the battle turned into a slaughter, it was Glorfindel, alongside the legendary Ecthelion of the Fountain, who guarded the retreat. They held back tides of orcs and Balrogs so that the remnants of their people could escape. But his defining moment came later, in the year 510 of the First Age, during the fall of Gondolin. The city had stayed hidden for centuries, but eventually Morgoth found it, and he didn't send a scouting party. He unleashed the full might of Angband, dragons of fire and steel, armies of orcs, and a host of Balrogs. The battle was desperate. We're talking brutal street-to-street fighting. Glorfindel and his Golden Flower warriors held the Great Market against overwhelming odds, buying time for the refugees to flee. But the city was doomed. King Turgon died, and the order was given to evacuate. And it was during this evacuation that Glorfindel took responsibility for the most critical job in the city, guarding the rear of the escape party. This wasn't just any group of refugees. It included Tur, Idril, and their young son Eärendil. And that kid? He's the one who eventually sailed to the gods and brought aid that saved the world. If he died, everyone died. So as they fled through a high and narrow mountain pass called the Eagle's Cleft, they were ambushed. A Balrog, a demon of shadow and flame, climbed the cliffs and blocked their path. Now pause for a second. In The Lord of the Rings, the entire Fellowship, including Gandalf, run away from the Balrog in Moria until they have no choice. In the First Age, Glorfindel didn't run. He realized that if he didn't act, the line of kings would end right there on the cliff. So he engaged the demon alone. Now, I want to be clear here. This wasn't a wizard duel with staffs and spells, and what Gandalf did in Moria was absolutely incredible, and I'm taking nothing away from that. But Glorfindel's battle was a visceral, physical brawl. Tolkien's description of this event in the Book of Lost Tales paints a picture that makes the Bridge of Khazad-dûm look like a polite disagreement. Just listen to how intense this fight was. Then Glorfindel leapt forward upon him, and his golden armor gleamed strangely in the moon. And he hewed at the demon that it leapt again upon a great boulder, and Glorfindel after. Now there was a deadly combat upon that high rock above the folk, and these, pressed behind and hindered ahead, were grown so close that well nigh all could see. The ardor of Glorfindel drave that Balrog from point to point, and his mail fended him from its whip and claw. This image is a warrior hunting a demon. Glorfindel physically overpowered the Balrog, driving it backward. He struck with such precision that he was literally taking the thing apart, and everyone was watching. Tolkien continues on to say, "Now had he beaten a heavy swinge upon its iron helm, now hewn off the creature's whip arm at the elbow. Then sprang the Balrog in the torment of his pain, and fear full at Glorfindel, who stabbed it like a dart of a snake. But he only found a shoulder and was grappled, and they swayed to a fall upon the crag top. In the end, it was a mutual kill. Glorfindel drove his dagger into the Balrog's shoulder, but as the demon fell backward over the cliff, it lashed out one last time in pure spite, and this is what we read. And it shrieked, and fell backwards from the rock, and falling, clutched Glorfindel's yellow locks beneath his cap, and those twain fell into the abyss." Glorfindel had a choice. He could have let go of his weapon, maybe tried to scramble back, but he didn't. He was pulled over the edge, plunging into the abyss alongside his enemy. Both of them crashed into the deep ravine below and were destroyed. His sacrifice worked. The refugees escaped, Eärendil lived, and the hope of the world was saved. Glorfindel's broken body was later recovered by the great eagle Thorondor and buried under a mound of stones. Despite the war, yellow flowers instantly sprang up from the rock to cover his grave. And that, by all the rules of literature and lore, should have been the end of him. In the First Age, heroes died, people sang sad songs about them, and they stayed dead. So fast forward 40 years in the real world, and thousands of years in Middle-earth time. It's the 1950s, and Tolkien is writing The Fellowship of the Ring. In the chapter Flight to the Ford, he brings in a character named Glorfindel who lives in Rivendell. This second Glorfindel is an absolute powerhouse. When the hobbits and Aragorn are being hunted by the Nazgul, this guy shows up and changes the game. Gandalf explicitly says later that he is one of the mighty of the Firstborn, and that he has dwelt in the Blessed Realm. When he faces the Nazgul at the Ford of Bruinen, he doesn't just fight them, he reveals a spiritual power that drives them into the river. He glows with a spiritual light that Frodo can see from the Wraith world. But this created a massive headache for attentive readers and for Tolkien himself. If this was a new character, how could he have lived in the Blessed Realm if he was in exile in Middle-earth? The Noldor were banned from going back, and if it was the same character, how was he walking around Rivendell when we literally just watched him fall off a cliff and die in the First Age? In the early drafts, Tolkien didn't really have an answer. He even toyed with the idea of a new Glorfindel talking about his ancestors in Gondolin, implying that they were different guys from the same house. But Tolkien dropped that idea, and the book was published with the name standing and the background left totally vague. It wasn't until years later that Tolkien, being the perfectionist that he was, realized he had backed himself into a corner. So he started analyzing the name itself. You see, Tolkien had strict rules about names. In Elvish culture, names weren't just random labels, they described the person's soul and body. Glorfindel meant golden hair, and as we established, golden hair was super rare for a Noldoran elf. It was a unique physical trait. Tolkien concluded that it would have been virtually impossible for two different high-ranking Noldoran elves to have the same exact name. It wasn't like naming a human John or Steve. To have two Glorfindels would be like having two Zeuses or two Poseidons. It broke the reality of his world. So Tolkien made a decision. He decided that the Glorfindel who died in Gondolin must be the same person as the Glorfindel in Rivendell. While most authors would have just written it off and let the fans figure it out, Tolkien decided that he needed to retroactively invent an entire theological mechanism for resurrection to fix this plot hole. He had to explain how a dead elf came back to life and returned to Middle-earth. Tolkien's solution is found in his last writings, a collection of essays written near the end of his life. And honestly, the explanation he came up with is way cooler than if he had just changed the name. First, we have to understand elf death. When elves die, they aren't dead like humans. Their bodies are destroyed, but their spirits, or their Fëa, are immortal and bound to the world. The spirit goes to the halls of Mandos in Valinor to wait. Usually, the Noldor who died in Middle-earth were banned from returning to life, or at least kept in Mandos for a very, very long time as a punishment for their rebellion. But Tolkien reasoned that Glorfindel was special. He looked at Glorfindel's record. His participation in the rebellion was reluctant. He did it for his friends, not for power. And more importantly, his death was an act of pure, selfless sacrifice. He didn't die for glory, he died to save an entire civilization. Because of this, the Valar granted him an expedited pardon. His guilt was purged, his ban was lifted, and he was deemed fully rehabilitated almost immediately. And Glorfindel wasn't just forgiven, he was re-embodied. The Valar gave him his body back, free of the weariness of Middle-earth. But Tolkien went a step further. He wrote that Glorfindel stayed in Valinor for centuries after his resurrection. During this time, he lived among the remaining Eldar and the Maiar in the Blessed Realm. He literally walked in the gardens of the gods. Tolkien explicitly stated that during this time, Glorfindel's spirit was enhanced. He became almost angelic. After long years in Valinor with the companionship of the Maya, we read that to these he had become now almost an equal, which is one of the most insane things in all of Tolkien's lore, that an elf became almost on the same level as a Maya. This is the key that unlocks everything. The Glorfindel we meet in The Lord of the Rings is so powerful, not just because he's an ancient warrior who's really old, but because he is fundamentally a different category of being. He is a resurrected elf who has been empowered by the gods. He exists in both the seen and unseen worlds at the same time, which is why he glows white to Frodo. He has seen the light of Valinor twice, once by birth and once by resurrection. Now, Tolkien did struggle with when to send the super elf back to Middle-earth. At first, he thought maybe Glorfindel came back around the year 1000 of the Third Age, on the same ship as Gandalf. This would have made them buddies from the start, and some people theorize that Glorfindel would have been friends with Olorin, Gandalf's Maiar form, in the Blessed Realm. But then Tolkien realized that this broke one of his major historical rules. After the downfall of Numenor in the Second Age, the world was made round, and Valinor was removed from the physical world. The straight road was hidden. Elves could leave Middle-earth, but they couldn't come back. The wizards were exceptions because they were divine spirits sent by God. An elf, even a resurrected one, shouldn't be able to sail against the flow of history. So to keep things consistent, Tolkien decided Glorfindel must have returned during the Second Age before the world changed. He likely arrived around the year 1600 of the Second Age, right when Sauron was forging the One Ring. He was sent specifically by the Valar to help Gil-galad and Elrond, serving as a divine emissary way before the Istari ever showed up. So now that we have the metaphysics down, let's look at how this changes his story in the later ages, because suddenly, his high status in Rivendell makes a lot more sense. Glorfindel returned to Middle-earth right when things were getting bad. Sauron was forging the ring, completing Barad-dûr, and deceiving the elves. Glorfindel wasn't just a soldier, he was a symbol. Imagine the morale boost for the elven armies. They were led by a general who had literally killed a Balrog, died, met the gods, and came back because he hated evil that much. He brought the spiritual authority of the West to the battlefield. While the records are sparse, Tolkien confirmed that he played a notable part in the Wars of Eriador, serving as Gil-galad's lieutenant. His most famous moment before the War of the Ring happened in the Third Age, during the war against the Witch King of Angmar. At the Battle of Fornost, the armies of Angmar were crushed, but at the end, the Witch King, seeing he lost, rode out to challenge the human King Eärnur. Eärnur's horse was terrified and bolted, and the Witch King laughed. But then, Glorfindel rode up. The reaction of the Witch King here is telling. It seems like he can't face the glory of Glorfindel. This wasn't just fear of a guy with a sword. The Ringwraiths live in the unseen world, so to them, Glorfindel was a blinding beacon of spiritual light that directly countered their dark magic. And because of this, the Witch King fled into the night. It was right here that Glorfindel stopped Eärnur from chasing him and dropped the famous prophecy. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall. For decades, readers thought that this was just standard elvish foresight, but knowing he's a resurrected being, this takes on a whole new weight. This is a pronouncement of fate from someone who has dwelt with Mandos, the doomsman of the Valar. He was speaking with the authority of the other side. And this brings us full circle to the Fellowship of the Ring. When Elrond finds out the Nazgûl are hunting Frodo, he has to decide who to send. He doesn't send an army, he sends Glorfindel. This wasn't a random choice, it was a strategic deployment of a specific counterweapon. Elrond knew the Nazgûl used fear as their primary weapon, and Glorfindel, being who he was the antithesis of fear. Think about the flight to the ford. Glorfindel finds the hobbits, puts Frodo on his horse Asfaloth, and faces down the Nine. When the ambush happens at the river, Glorfindel doesn't hide. He stands openly against all 9 Ringwraiths. While Gandalf and Elrond controlled the water, it was Glorfindel's spiritual presence revealed in his wrath that drove them into the flood. He herded them like cattle. The Witch King, who had just stabbed Frodo and terrified everyone else, was powerless against him, and was one of the few who got drowned in the river. Later, at the Council of Elrond, Glorfindel sits in a place of honor. He isn't just an advisor, he's a living link between the First Age, the Valar, and the current struggle. He represents the entire history of the Noldor, the fall, the redemption, and the return. And something super interesting that we're finding throughout his entire lore is that Glorfindel never takes a place of power. While he could have tried to take kingship for himself or be the leader of Rivendell instead of Elrond, he chose to be an advisor, a lieutenant, and a supporter of all of the elves that were in power ahead of him, which I think goes to show one of the main reasons that the Valar loved him so much. So what are we left with? Glorfindel is a total anomaly. He is the only Noldoran elf known to have lived, died, been judged, forgiven, re-embodied, power-leveled by angels, and sent back to the mortal world to fight the Shadow a second time. His existence is a testament to Tolkien's integrity as a creator. A lesser writer would have just changed the name to Glorfindel Jr. in the second edition and called it a day. It would have been an easy fix. But Tolkien refused to compromise the meaning of names in his world and go for cheap tricks to fix plot holes. Instead, he engaged in this complex process of creation and correction. In doing so, he accidentally created what is effectively the sixth member of the Istari. Glorfindel fills the same narrative role as the wizards, a divine emissary sent to guide and protect, and in fact, he was sent thousands of years before the Istari. We see that Glorfindel's arc mirrors Gandalf's almost perfectly. Both fought a Balrog on a mountain peak to save their friends, both died in the process, both were sent back by the higher powers, enhanced and clothed in white to finish the job. Glorfindel the MISTAKE became the prototype for the resurrection of Gandalf the White. He stands as proof that in Middle-earth, death isn't always the end, and that sometimes the greatest errors can lead to the most magnificent legends. He is the golden flower that bloomed twice, a light from the ancient West shining in the twilight of the Third Age. So was he equal to Gandalf? Maybe not in authority, but in terms of raw spiritual power and anti-shadow capability, he's pretty close. And that is why he is Tolkien's greatest creative accident. As always, thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe if you enjoy breakdowns like this. And like I said in the beginning, feel free to try to fill in any gaps that I have here today, as I'm sure I missed a few things. After all, I don't think it's possible to summarize Tolkien's decades of works in just a few minutes online. Thanks to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, Robo Steve, and the rest of my incredible members who help make these videos possible every month. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.